All right, thanks everybody for being here tonight. I think those of you watching from home, we're continuing the study of why I believe the current plan is to do it tonight and then 2 more Wednesdays. And then we're going to be shifting gears and doing a different study on Sunday morning with a follow-up, a bit more discussion-oriented class on Wednesday nights of the same material from Sunday morning. Brett and I are going to be teaching a class on Proverbs, and we're going to go through that as long as it takes. No real end date for that. So we'll cover on Sunday morning out here in the auditorium the Proverbs. Brett and I will be sharing the teaching of that, and we'll be more textually oriented on Sundays, and then a bit more discussion oriented. It's hard to have a discussion in there anyway. We'll be more discussion oriented on the same Proverbs on Wednesday nights. I will continue to, my plan is to put up some of the material that might have been presented in the class. I'll record that and just upload that to the Facebook page. So I'll make sure I have a clean wall behind me when I record that and put that up there. But tonight, in continuing that, we've got one more major argument for the existence of God. Next week, there's going to be 12 additional arguments. And those 12 additional arguments, some of them are kind of variations of things we've seen. There are a couple of them that are very different, one of which is very well suited to our relativistic, if you will, culture. And it doesn't rely on anything that we've talked about so far. I really like that one. But again, the whole goal of that is to have spaghetti, something sticks on somebody. So that's why you cover so many of them. And then we'll have a class after that that'll kind of wrap it up. I'm going to call it Paul Harvey-ish, the rest of the story, and that'll be the last one here on Wednesday night. I had suggested to everybody, and if you're at home, you can go start it now to make sure you have some caffeine, so go get a Diet Coke or a coffee, because tonight's argument is completely different than anything we've tried before. And it's a rather mind-bending thing to get your head around. If I don't look at this for a good while, it's mind-bending for me to get my head back around it. But it's called the conceptualization argument. Another word for it is even worse than that, the ontological argument. One of the first things they tell you when you're going to be a teacher or a preacher is don't ever start off by apologizing. But I'm way too honest to pretend that I don't need to apologize when we're starting on a few things. But this one goes all the way back to Anselm, an English philosopher who lived nearly 1,000 years ago. So this is not something new. It's been around a long, long time. So we can blame him if this hurts tonight. The argument's profound, but it's also very simple as well. So here's the argument. Okay, here's the argument. And you've got a piece of paper because it's going to be some interactive things. I need to ask you to write down a few things as we go through it. But the argument says, imagine or think of a being so perfect that you cannot possibly think of anything greater. Okay? And so formally you could say, that than which none greater or more perfect can be conceived. Okay? What would such a being be like? What would such a being be like? What characteristics would this being that would be so perfect you can't think of anything greater, and that than which none greater can be conceived? What characteristics or qualities would such a being have? Let's call this being A. So if you don't mind, on your paper, I'd like to ask you, A, and then list a couple of things, a couple of characteristics or qualities that being A ought to possess, if in fact it is a being so perfect you can't possibly think of something greater, or that than which nothing greater can be conceived. So take just a minute, and those of you at home, again, it's always easy to still have your fuzzy slippers on and start the coffee. I think you may need your coffee. Get a piece of paper and just go with us. I'm going to actually pause for about a minute. Write down a couple of qualities, at least a couple, qualities that if you're thinking of this greatest possible being, qualities or characteristics that this being will almost certainly have to possess. Okay? And if you don't, if you come up with only one or two, that's fine. I mean, you can come up with a whole lot. We'll see what people come up with here in a minute. And after you see it the first time, you probably get the hang of it. We need the music from Jeopardy playing, right? Bum, 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 bum. Bum, bum, bum. Start off too high. Bum, bum. Bum, 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 bum. Fortunately, nobody's texted me yet saying, please talk about anything other than this. You have at least one or two things written down? All right. Okay, so what would such a being be like, right? I don't want all from the same person. So let's call this being A. So as I say, take a moment, write down a list of some qualities. And so here I've got a few blanks. Howard, give me one quality or characteristic that this greatest possible being would possess or have to have. You think what? Think you would know it all. Okay. Yep. Otherwise, right, you could always imagine a being that would know it all somehow. So did everybody have that one or think of that one that comes to mind? And if not, right, oh yeah, okay, sure. That needs to be on my list at the very least.
I called it wisdom. I'm not sure if those are exactly the same.
Wisdom, really smart. And you wouldn't know, if it's the greatest possible, there wouldn't be anybody with more wisdom. Wouldn't be anybody who would be smarter, whichever way we want to go with that, right?
It's beyond knowing all. It's like he knows the outcome in every predicament.
Well, that would be hopefully all-knowing, because he would know all future possibilities and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Sure. All right. What about a different characteristic? Anybody have something different?
Eternal.
So never having begun or something like that, right?
Before there was Genesis, he was already there.
Remember, we can't go to Genesis. We're not going to Genesis with this one. I know you don't like that, but I'm not going to that.
Alpha and Omega.
Well, all right, that's still going to Genesis, or at least Greek. So we could say no beginning, because you can imagine a being that would have no beginning, whatever that means, as opposed to me that had a beginning a few years ago. Any being that's been around longer than me, by definition, should at least have a quality.
We are technically everlasting, but he is eternal.
Good right there, right? So certainly knows everything, always been here. What about another one? Did you have a different one than any of those two?
All powerful.
Good. All powerful. So, and you can imagine, right? Obviously, we could do an arm wrestling contest in here and somebody in the room would win. But that wouldn't mean there's not somebody down the street who's got an even stronger arm. And so you would, for the greatest possible being, this being would tend to need to know everything, have been around forever, or not have a beginning, would be all powerful. I mean, I think you're coming up with the things that, now that you realize what we're going to be doing with it, seem pretty obvious. So, in this case, right, if you did not include all knowing, would you have a different one? What did you do?
I got a text from Leanne. It says forgiving, caring, and honest. Forgiving,
caring, and honest. Those are definitely, thank you for watching. I miss you quite a bit. But those are also that way, right? Because it wouldn't be a truly the greatest possible being if it didn't possess the ability of empathizing and forgiving, or if it was this being was dishonest, because that would involve having two different sides, so to speak, of the coin in there. So if you did not have all powerful, that would make a good addition to a list, right? So if somebody in here writing down all their list of qualities, if you didn't have all powerful, if you didn't have knows everything, that would be something you would want to add to it, right?
Sinless.
What's that?
Sinless.
Sinless, perfect in that sense, right? Makes no mistakes. I mean, I haven't made any in at least the last 30 seconds. But beyond that, right, at some point I fall off that wagon. So if it's a being so great, so perfect, that you cannot think of anything greater, it would have to be all-knowing. Because, again, this is us thinking of a being. And so if you thought of a being that, Mr. Spock or whatever, Mr. Spock's pretty smart, but even then there's some things he doesn't know. And so this being would be greater than Mr. Spock, right? The greatest possible being would have to know everything by definition, or we could imagine a being that would be greater than that. Knows everything except knows nothing about baseball. And not the greatest possible being, because you can imagine a being even greater that would know all the things about baseball. The batting average is down to the billionth place or whatever, things like that. If it were not all knowing, right, then you could think of a being that had the same qualities that might be on your list, but that also could be all knowing. So you would add something to it, or you would add to it. All right. If you insisted on, if you continued insisting that you were thinking of a being greater than which nothing could exist, it would also have to be all good. And I would put forgiving in all good. It's good to forgive. I would think that not being evil, not being dishonest would also be kind of lumped into this all good. Because if you did not think of that, I would suppose you would agree, oh yeah, okay, sure. It needs to be not only all-knowing and all-powerful, it needs to be all good as well, right? Because if you can't think of anything greater, so perfect, then if it didn't have all knowledge, if it wasn't all good, then you're not thinking of the greatest possible being. You'd be contradicting yourself. And in order to resolve the contradiction, no, I am thinking of the greatest possible being, and it does not know everything. Well, hello, right? That's a contradiction, because knowing everything would make it even greater, right? You would be saying, in essence, I'm conceiving of a being so perfect, I can't imagine anything greater, but I can think of something greater, because it would have less ability, less capability, less qualities, fewer qualities than a being that had everything you might have been thinking of and knew everything. So you would have to change that. You'd have to add to the list of being A, and add, all knowing. You'd have to add all good, things like that, right? Also, if you couldn't think of anything greater, like it would have to be all good. Otherwise, you'd have to avoid contradicting yourself. You'd have to think, oh, my bad. I didn't realize that. I didn't think of that. So true. I agree with you. To conceive of the greatest possible being, it would have to be all-knowing and all good. So you would rearrange your definition in your mind, and you would add all good, all-knowing, all-powerful to it, right? So if you're conceiving of a being greater than which nothing can possibly exist, it's got to have those kind of qualities to it. All right. So this is nowhere near a complete list, but see if you would agree that the greatest possible being would have to have all-knowing, have to be all-knowing, would have to be all good. You would think it would have to be all-powerful, and we would insist back to kind of all good to an extent, right? And forgiving and things like that, all-loving, all-loving. Otherwise, you would have to add one of these qualities to your list. Well, I can think of a being, it's all these things, but it's good sometimes, or it's loving sometimes and hateful sometimes. Well, right? That's not what I would suggest we ought to think of as the most powerful possible being. Now, I want you to, here comes the steps of the argument, the approach. This being that we were just talking about exists in our minds right now, because you're thinking about and came up with a list of qualities. I asked you to think about a being greater than which nothing could possibly exist, and we came up with pretty much a similar kind of list of qualities. Home came up with forgiving and loving, all-powerful. Right now, if we have talked about it, I would suggest that each of us in here, and those of you at home, that being exists between our ears. It's in our ears right now, because if you're thinking about that being, it exists in the mind. I mean, there's an ice cream cone right now that exists in my mind, because I'm thinking right this moment of an ice cream cone. Same way, if we're thinking about the greatest possible being, that being exists in our minds right now. So in this case, right, you've got at least five qualities for being A right now, the being that exists in the mind. Okay, and this again is Anselm's argument. Strangely enough, I don't know what he was doing 1,000 years ago, but he came up with it 1,000 years ago in England. All right, but does this being exist outside of our minds? I would put that it's not a point to argue that it does not exist in our minds, because it does, right? It exists in our minds. You're thinking about it right now. Those of you at home, if you've been following, you should have come to a mind of most powerful being. Yeah, it's all powerful, it's all good, it's all loving. It exists in between our ears. The question is, does it exist outside of our minds? So here we go. Okay? So let's suppose you've got this. Let's think of another being B. This is being A, the one that's between our ears. Okay, being A. Being B has all the exact same qualities, but also has the characteristic that it exists in reality, not simply in our minds. Okay? No other difference between them. One of them exists only between my ears, and the other one is real. This being A is real in the sense of there are some electrons in my brain or whatever, neurons that are firing, but it has no concrete reality outside of in between my ears right here, right? So this one exists in reality separate and apart from our brains thinking about this being.
So wouldn't being B symbolize the characteristics of being A, which means that being B is outside our mind?
Yes.
Otherwise, how would we draw all-knowing, all-powerful, so on?
The key here is you imagine being A was right here, right? I would suggest it really exists in our head. Now I'm just saying, well, wouldn't being B, in fact, be greater than being A? If it's real, isn't that better than imagining a pink unicorn? Right? A pink unicorn exists in my brain, right? But in this case, being B, I'm saying if being B exists in reality, by definition, it should be greater than being A that only exists here in between my ears. That's the first step really in the argument, right? Here comes the key move in the argument. If you are conceiving, if you're thinking of a being so great, greater than which nothing can possibly exist, you really can't be thinking of being A that exists only in your brain. Because being B would be greater still. Think about that for a minute. This is a key step. If you're trying, the question was, the assignment was, think of a being greater than which nothing can possibly exist. And we came up with, I did too, the being that existed right here in my brain, right? However, wouldn't a being that was real be greater than the being that's only between my ears? I would argue anyone would have to say yes. And so when you're thinking of the greater than which nothing can possibly exist, you really should be thinking, and you have been thinking, should be thinking of B, being B, rather than being A. Okay? Now, that doesn't necessarily mean being B exists, but you're thinking about a being that would exist in reality and saying that would be greater than a being that's only between my ears.
But I was thinking about, I didn't know about being B.
You already went to B.
Yeah,
already
but I
went
was
to being
thinking
B.
about being
You were
B.
thinking about B. Phil skipped ahead of being A, which is okay. That's okay. You were a step ahead, right? Because many people might have thought, well, yeah, it's right up here in my brain. But if you only were thinking of imagining, right, using your imagination for a greatest being, if it were real, wouldn't that make it greater than something that's just purely imaginary? I mean, it's really fun, right? It's great to think of a pink unicorn. But if one of them came walking in here, that'd be the greatest thing that's ever happened to me from a pink unicorn. Obviously, because when you cut those up and fry them, they taste like donuts. I'm kidding. But
So does real mean that it's physically real?
it exists outside of the brain. It's not merely in here. Whatever that means, it's got some kind of reality outside of merely my imagination.
The unicorn example was walked in here. Could there be a unicorn that was real that we couldn't see?
That would be a good step, right? That might lead to being D, E, and F if we wanted to, because a being maybe that was located only in our building right now could conceivably be the greatest being, but wouldn't it be an even greater being if it was everywhere at once? You know, that kind of stuff. So, good point. My analogy of the pink unicorn is falling apart just a tad. But if a pink unicorn falls in, somebody walks in and grab your camera quickly. We want a picture of that. Okay? So I'm going to suggest if we're thinking of the greatest possible being, we really need to focus on being B, because this being that had all these qualities and really existed would in fact be greater than one that only existed in my brain. Okay? We haven't said whether it's really out there or not, but if it did exist in reality, it would be greater than one that's only in between my ears. I told you it's mind bending, so just hang in there. All right? If you think about this, right, I'm not a painter, but I can imagine painting something that would marvel the Mona Lisa. Okay? It would look like stick figures. But right now, that's in reality, but right now in my imagination, Gene the artiste. Right? It's in my brain. The question is, could it turn into reality? Well, maybe if I had 1,000 years to paint it, something like that. For me, probably not. But there's this painting in my mind. If I could translate it into reality, that would be even greater. Leonardo had the Mona Lisa probably in his brain first, but aren't we glad that the paint is greater to have that thing actually hanging on the wall of the museum, except when people are throwing paint at it and all that kind of fun stuff. All right? So the second painting, the one that's real, is in fact greater than the one that's merely in my mind. I'm just making sure we are agreeing on that point right there, okay? So let's assume that the being that we exist, the being that we've been considering exists only in the first sense. Being A exists only in our minds. Being A is then, right, all-knowing, all-good, all-powerful, all-knowing, and exists only in the mind. So that's our definition of being A. That's what I was trying to get us to think through when we wrote down those qualities. Being A is only in here, all right? So look, here we go. There's being A. Being B, however, exists in the mind and reality, because I'm asking us to think of a being that is in our brains, but also would be real. It doesn't make it real, but I'm asking you, you're thinking of a being that is real, whether it exists or not. So here's being A and being B, right? If you say, I'm conceiving of a being so perfect, so great, that I cannot think of anything greater, but that being only exists in my mind, you're contradicting yourself, because being B would in fact be greater than being A. And so to remove the contradiction, you'd have to give up thinking of being A, and you'd have to think of being B. Okay? So I want us to be thinking of being B for going forward. All right. This is essentially what I've been saying. To avoid contradicting yourself, you've got to say, yep, okay. Being B is the top of the heap right now. He's the top of the heap. So you have to be considering this being B, which must exist in the mind, right? All right, let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back and imagine I need to think of a being, I need to be focused and thinking on a being greater than which nothing can possibly exist, okay? Perhaps this being has all sorts of, maybe this being has all sorts of amazing qualities, but we've been saying the being you're thinking of exists in reality, but you might think, yeah, that would be the greatest possible being, but it still might not exist, right? It would be the greatest possible unicorn would be the real one walking in here, but I can say, yeah, but the real unicorn may not really exist, right? So I'm thinking of the greatest possible unicorn would be one that was real, okay, but I can also imagine that it's not real. So thinking about being B, the greatest possible being would be one that is real, but somebody might, if you're talking to somebody about this stuff, and I don't know where you would be talking about this, you'd have to be with a coffee shop, I presume. The person might very well respond, okay, yeah, that would be the greatest possible being, but I don't believe that being is real. Okay? That's a very common response, especially if somebody doesn't already think that being B is real. All right. I can certainly imagine that it might not exist. I can conceive that being B is not real. Sure. I mean, that's why we have a lot of people that aren't believers, because they may have heard about God, but think, nah, not real. I can understand about God, but I don't see any proof that God is real, so I'm not going to believe that God is real. Okay? If that is the case, then the being you are considering actually must be capable of being thought not to exist. Being C. We're going to move to being C now. And again, this is what Anselm did. I wish I'd met that guy.
So, in that case, being A would exist only in the mind.
Being A is only in the mind. Being B would be the greater being still, right? If it was real, being C is the one a doubter would probably think of. And so here's what the doubter would say, right? All-knowing, yeah, sure. The greatest possible being would be all-knowing, all-good, all-powerful, all-loving, and could be thought of not to exist. Okay? Could be thought of not to exist. And again, so far, I don't think anything I put up here is trickery. I think this is pretty true. You could think of somebody who is great, that would exist in reality, that would have all these qualities, but somebody said, yeah, but it's not real. So that person is thinking of being C down here. Does that make sense too? Somebody that doesn't believe or is a doubter would say that that being can be thought of not to exist. Okay? So here's being C again, right? But I could think of another being. We're going to go from being C now to being D.
Oh.
I told you to have some coffee. Being D is exactly like C, except it cannot be thought of not to exist. No, slow down. Being C, okay, yeah, it's all powerful, it's all knowing. It would be great if it existed, but I can imagine it does not. Okay? Being D, on the other hand, has all those qualities, but you cannot possibly imagine it's not real. Wouldn't that be a greater being than one that could be doubted and not thought to exist? Wouldn't a being that you can't even imagine isn't real, wouldn't that be a greater being in terms of the greater than which nothing can exist, would be this being D that you cannot even think of it. It's required to accept that it exists. So here's being D, all knowing, all good, all powerful, all loving, and cannot be thought of not to exist. That would truly be a greater being, certainly than C, because being C is, yeah, here's this being, but it can be doubted. Being D, on the other hand, has all these qualities, but it's impossible to doubt whether it's real or not. You can't even imagine that it's not real. From here, the reasoning flows as if it was flowing before. If you're thinking, and again, I asked you, think of the being greater than which nothing can possibly exist, right? So if you were thinking of a being so perfect you cannot think of anything better, you have to be thinking of D, because a being that cannot be doubted would be a greater being than a being that could be doubted. I'm slowing down because this is a key thought. Remember we said, if you thought of the greatest possible being, but it was not all loving, then you had to change your mind. Oh, I wasn't thinking of the greatest possible being, because an all-loving being would be even greater. So the same thing here. If you were thinking of being C previously, where being C could be doubted, right? You're not thinking of the greatest possible being. I want you to think of the greatest possible being. And the greatest possible being would be one that you cannot even doubt its existence. It must exist, and I cannot doubt that being D exists. So I'd have to avoid contradicting myself, quit thinking of being C, and I'd have to begin thinking of being D, which is all-knowing, all-good, all-powerful, all-loving, and cannot be thought of not to exist. Because if I slip from here and I go back to being A, which only exists in the brain, I'm not thinking of the greatest possible being, because a being that not only exists in reality but cannot be doubted, certainly greater than the being in my brain. If I'm thinking of a being that has all these qualities that could exist in reality, but nah, I don't believe it, you have not yet thought of the greatest possible being. The greatest possible being is going to have all those qualities, exist in reality, and you cannot doubt that it exists.
But that's B.
No. B simply could be thought of to exist in reality. It might not. Being B was, if it existed in reality, it would be greater. And by the way, again, I know you're scribbling. You're going to get all this stuff on the handout, but with all these words, I've been trying to have us step through it, listening and talking and thinking from. So if you're thinking of a being that you could doubt, nah, I just don't believe that's real, you have yet to think of the greatest possible being, because the greatest possible being would be one that would have all these qualities and could not be doubted. Okay? So you can conceive of a being greater that has all these qualities of C, except you cannot doubt that it exists. You cannot doubt that it exists. And if you do doubt, you're not thinking of the greatest possible being. So if my encouraging is to say, think of the greatest possible being, you have to think of a being that you cannot possibly doubt exists. Okay? And so to avoid, you've got to change your mind and go with being D right here, right? All knowing, all good, all powerful, all loving, and cannot be thought not to exist. So this being we're talking about here obviously is God. Whatever that means in our argument for the existence of God, we have not defined it as much as some want to jump to Genesis and other places in the Bible. We're simply talking about first cause, a designer, the greatest possible being, wherever, if ever, that can be found in human existence. We're simply saying the first cause argument said there was a cause, that's why everything's here. The design argument said that's where there's design. The moral argument says that's why some things are always wrong, with the horrific example I gave. And this one says, if you're thinking of the greatest possible being, you actually have to be thinking of a being that is so great you cannot doubt that it's not real. You have to believe that it's real. And this being we're talking about here is God. So you may not be know exactly at this point what God is like, but you can know that God can be thought of as existing and cannot be thought of as not existing. Otherwise, you're not thinking of the greatest possible being. That would be a task that would be impossible if you held on to, you're not fulfilling the assignment, right? You're not thinking of the greatest possible being if you continue to think of a being that, but it's not real. Well, there's a being that would be greater than that, and that's one that you cannot possibly doubt. You cannot possibly doubt. So, that than which a greater cannot be conceived is God, whatever that word means in this context, in this situation. And God, therefore, must exist because the assignment was think of the greatest possible being, and the greatest possible being is one you cannot doubt. And if you're doubting at all, you're not thinking of the greatest possible being. The greatest possible being is one that must exist. So what do you make of this one? The value of this argument, okay? Now, the fact that I put this up here suggests I know what the response is to this argument. In my years of working with people, to my knowledge, this one has never yet said, oh, okay, you're right. God has to be real, and they change completely. It's simply another piece of spaghetti to throw at the wall and see if it sticks. Now, I'll open it up for comments, and I've got some on this myself that I will make, but what were you thinking?
I don't understand why you have to, that anyone's trying to say that that's God.
It's
I
simply,
know what we do, but
what word would you give the greatest possible being?
the greatest possible being.
Okay, well, we're going to call it by shorthand and say God.
But if they don't know it's God.
If they don't know it's God, that's the whole point. Then you go to that's why the study continues. The first cause. We may call that God. They just may want to stick with first mover, first cause. They may want to say the grand designer, right?
We didn't talk about designer.
I know, when we talked about design in the previous arguments. That argument is the designer. Well, that's God. No, we haven't talked about that yet. Quite right. That's a shorthand. I know we are understanding the cause is God, the designer is God, the source of all good from the moral argument would be God. And in this case, this being, the greatest possible being, is also God. If somebody does not connect that with God, that's fine for the moment, because then you got to say, all right, this being that we've been talking about, what kind of qualities does this being have? Well, it was here before anything else, whatever that means, and called everything into existence. Okay. It's also the one that designed everything. The solar system, laid out the galaxies, laid out the blood clotting cascade, and designed everything. Okay. It's also why I can say it's always wrong to do X. And it's also the greatest possible being. And then all those 12 arguments we talk about next week. So how would you characterize this being? If you don't want to call it God, you could simply, if somebody wants to come into worship services and talk about the first cause, okay, we will eventually go to say, has this greatest possible being communicated to humanity? Maybe not, right? How do I know that this greatest possible being has spoken to anybody in human history? Maybe this greatest possible being has, maybe it hasn't. That would be the next step to say, all right, there's something out there. I understand the first cause, the designer, the source of all good, to know good from evil, and this greatest possible being. Does it care about me? Has it spoken to me? Does it make any demands on me? I mean, I've never had the sky open up and something speak directly to me, so what would you do? We're not going to do it in this class, but what the question is do we know enough about this being, whatever we call it, to see whether it cares about us? My argument is all that fine-tuned nature that we talked about last week suggests the Goldilocks principle that there's a strong reason to believe that this being put us here and cared enough to make sure that things are just right. That was the purpose, really, of the Goldilocks principle. And so if the being cares enough to make sure everything here is just right, then you would say, all right, has this being communicated? And then you start studying any and all world religions. I mean, you could assume, like, let's suppose it has. Let me go check. And if nothing clicks, if nothing connects with me that it came from this being, I would say this being exists, but maybe doesn't care about me, doesn't care about us. And so you look at the world religions, which again, we talked about previously, but you would look and say, does this world religion reflect the qualities that this greatest being has? Okay, well, this source of all good, the religion shouldn't tell people to lie, shouldn't tell people to kill. The religion shouldn't tell people, the communication from this being shouldn't tell people that 51% of the human race are worse than donkeys, which one of the world religions does, right? Females, women. 51% of the human race should not be devalued from a religious perspective. The first cause, does the world religion say that there was a beginning? There was a beginning. Even science says there's a beginning. If the world religion does not say that there's a beginning, sorry, it fails the test. And so that would be one way to say what's left. What satisfies qualities that would fit with this greatest possible being? You might have one or two religions left. You would discard a number of them. I mean, several of the Eastern religions don't say there was a beginning. They say that the world and the universe is eternal. It's not. Okay? It's not. So that would be, those are the next steps. You've got to go through that stuff. At this point, if somebody says, I don't like the term God for this being, I don't worry about it. Because I will stick with first cause, designer, source of all good, and greatest possible being. Those are the conclusions of the main arguments we've done so far. So I don't care if somebody doesn't call it God at this point. Because we haven't talked about God. That's just our shorthand. It's also a signal to anybody who is a religious background to know, oh, okay, I see what you're going for. Phil?
Yeah, I've tried to conceptualize this in my mind.
Appropriate for this argument.
And I'm envisioning two columns. One is A, B, C, and D. But the other, the second column, are those world religions that fit in one of those categories. Is that...
It's not a bad approach.
Does that make sense?
And to do that, you've got to understand the other world religions. This is a long process.
Well, true, yeah.
So you have to look at, you can go with the major ones. Eventually, if the religion only has two people that know about it, you might think this greatest being has done a really poor job telling people about itself. If only two people know anything about it, right? So that's why you would think it would be one of the large religions. And so you would at least look at Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, and Buddhism. And I might even go a little further if somebody were inclined to some of these smaller religions. But some of them are going to get put into a column of that doesn't fit when they say that the universe is eternal. When they don't have a beginning taught from the religion, that's a disqualification for what we have been studying, for what science and the arguments tell us. So some of these are going to get put over here right away once you get to that point. And then you'll have some other ones that have passed many of the tests, right? And I argue one of the major world religions, one of its leaders had said 3 things corrupt prayer: donkey, wine, and women. And if this world religion has such a poor place for women, does that sound like a creator that's focused on a being that's focused on all good, who would be the source of all good and no evil and all? I don't think so, right? And so compare that to other religions and see, is there one that says we are all one, that there's really no difference to this being between men and women and things like that, and or you would think if it's all loving, the religion should be saying all loving and don't kill people, stuff like that. But it's a long process. So if somebody had gone to church, right, they grew up Christian and they've started having doubts, it would probably end up a shorter discussion. If you find where the doubt's coming from with one of these arguments or something can click and they're back on track. If you're coming from somebody that has never heard of religion before and you're trying to go through this, that would be a long, long process. That would take the entire study.
As would an atheist.
From an atheist perspective. I mean, we're not even, the last part of it would be, okay, if you're going to say it's Christianity, I know this is not a surprise, I do say that it's Christianity, you've got to then say, okay, fine, how does Christianity's source, the Bible, how does it handle all these problems with science? And you got to look at, is the source trustworthy? It talks about people that lived to great old ages. It talks about a flood. It talks about all this kind of stuff. And so you've got to have that question, but you don't have that question with someone who doesn't know if God's real or not. That's what I meant when I said second or third level questions, right? So the study's intended to go down that path as far as somebody needs. But with this, let me give you my feel for the value of this argument. It helps in several ways. It does force a reappraisal of the problem of evil. The atheist claims that if God existed, God would not allow evil in the world. Okay? That's the argument. The problem of evil says if God were real, he wouldn't allow evil. He wouldn't allow this to happen to this child. That's the argument that gets pushed into the face of religious people, right? But the atheist is assuming that God's existence is possible, but not real because of evil. Catch that for a moment. The atheist, in this case, making this objection, if God were real, well, he could be, but I know he's not because of evil. So it's possible. Remember, we were talking about being be. So the being would be existing, but I doubt. And so it fits into that discussion of A, B, C, and D, going through the beings, going through those lists of different beings for the greatest possibility, right? Also, this argument it really kind of forces, to an extent, it can turn the tables a bit, and it makes someone who has the doubt be arguing, but he's not real. Okay? Because this argument would say, you conceive of something you cannot doubt, but I doubt him anyway. And so they're making an assertion at that point. It's hard to prove a negative, but it turns the tables a bit. Instead of having to make the case that God is real, it gets the other person engaged in saying why they're not real. Why is being E not the greatest possible being? Because I do doubt. Why do you doubt? And we'll get that kind of conversation going. Because many times it'll be, prove it to me, and somebody will clam up. But if you get somebody saying, well, here's my real problems with it, then you can talk about it. You can talk about it. All right, conclusions. Look, I told you, it's a very different kind of argument, and it's focused up here. It's greatly up here, and it won't click for a number of people. If there were 1,000 people who have doubts, and we went through this one, first of all, a great number of people will probably get up and leave. I mean, they'd be like, oh, yeah, and that's one reason I sit toward the front. It makes it difficult for people to get up and leave during class. But it's a difficult thing, but it's coming at it from a totally different direction. And that's the key. Suppose you had 10 arguments, but they all came this way, right? Well, you got a big blind spot back here where you're not addressing anything. So you come at it from cause, you come at it from mover, you come at it from design, you come at it from the source of good and the moral argument. You come at it from Goldilocks and the fine-tuned nature of things. You come at it from the conceptualization argument. You come at it from the argument from conscience. That'll be next week. You come at it from all sorts of arguments. One of them next week is the argument from miracles. I'll give that one away. And it starts out, there are numerous, well-attested miracles. Obviously, then, God has to be true, because miracles is suspension of natural law. Only the divine can do that. What's the problem with that argument? I haven't seen a miracle where something materialized on that table. And so somebody believes they've seen it, but that's where somebody's going to doubt that argument. But if you think you've seen a miracle, that may be a good enough argument for you. The key is you see where somebody is, and you provide arguments to keep people thinking, keep them engaged. That's the entire goal. It deals with much, much more pure philosophy. Maybe this would work if you were in a philosophy department. You might can imagine people sitting around a table with very refined coffees talking about this stuff, right? But it's simply, my whole point is it's another, and it is a major argument. This one is, if you were finding a book on philosophy, is God real? This one's going to have a whole chapter, and some of the ones next week will be relatively minor. So next week, we're going to go through quickly 12 different arguments, and you're going to have there'll be a lot of pages next week. A lot of paper. Read over them. Just be familiar with, somebody says, well, I just believe everybody needs to follow their conscience. Believe it or not, I think there's a pretty good argument for the existence of God from somebody that thinks that way. Because somebody that thinks everybody just needs to follow their conscience. And it's a very creative argument, which I like. And so, look, I hope you don't ever run into anyone, truly, who has doubts. The likelihood is that we're going to. I have, and I know some of you have. Having a resource kit, if you will, attached to your belt with some approaches to try to help people and ways to talk about it, being familiar with talking about it, at least can help engage if somebody wants to engage. The alternative, if we don't know these things, is, well, you do what you want to do, and we're not engaging at all, and we're supposed to be, remember the opening statement from 1 Peter, be ready to explain to people why you believe. And so these are some of the reasons I believe. And if they don't click for everybody, these are why I believe. I want to have some reason, some discussion point that can help somebody who's having doubts. Because, sure, there's an active doubter who doesn't want to give the time of day to any discussion. I'm not discussing this at all. I have no time for this. There are others who are doubting, and they feel really bad about it. They're doubting and they're like, is there really no God? Well, let's sit down and talk about it. That's a totally different conversation with someone who's I just don't know if God's really there. As opposed to somebody who says, there ain't no God. Why are you wasting my time? Totally different situation. And being familiar with some of these things may help strengthen somebody that's kind of wavering, perhaps. Mark, if you would, over in the corner, close us out with a nice, loud prayer. Thank you for joining us. Hopefully, you didn't fall asleep in your chair on the couch. Mark.
Dear God, we thank you for everything that you give us. We love you so much, and thank you that you give us the opportunity to come here to worship and to study your word. Thank you for Gene and what the lesson he brought to us tonight. I ask that we can at least take a bit of it, apply it to our lives, and apply it to our teaching, that we can bring others to you. We ask you to be with those that are hurting tonight, those that have great conflict. We ask you to bless them and watch over them. Thank you for this group here, Lord. We ask you to bless this church, bless all churches, that they can lead more people to you. In Christ's name we pray.
Thank you. See you next week.